They called her foolish, a woman alone, carving a life out of the wilderness. But day after day, she swung that axe, her hands blistered, her back burning, stacking one log after another, until a cabin began to rise from the earth. Across the ridge, a cowboy watched her, a man with eyes dulled by loss, his ranch silent since his wife passed. He told himself he was just curious, just making sure she didn't freeze or starve. But when he saw her stand in the rain, hammering the last beam into place with trembling hands and tears in her eyes, something inside him stirred. She wasn't just building a home, she was building the kind of strength he'd thought the world had long forgotten. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The winter sun broke over the ridge like a slow-burning ember, painting the valley in a cold, pale gold that seemed to stretch forever. And Elias Boone sat astride his horse at the edge of his land, the breath of the animal rising in thick plumes that vanished into the crisp morning air. From there he could see her, Clara, the stranger who'd arrived with nothing but a mule, a wagon full of lumber, and a stubbornness that had become the talk of every campfire for miles. Folks in town called her mad, said no woman had business setting up a homestead alone in country like this. But Elias had seen madness before, seen it in men broken by debt, whiskey, or war, and whatever burned in that woman wasn't madness. It was something fiercer, quieter, the kind of determination that could outlast hunger and frostbite alike. Day after day she worked, her figure small against the expanse of snow-dusted land, swinging her axe until the echo of it carried through the pines. He could tell she wasn't built for this, the softness in her hands, the way she sometimes faltered when lifting timber, but each time she stumbled, she got back up, and each night smoke curled from her half-built chimney like a flag of defiance. Elias told himself it wasn't his concern. He'd learned long ago that the frontier had no mercy for those who couldn't bend with it, and kindness, out here, had a way of turning on a man. Still, he found himself riding that ridge more often than he should have, his eyes drawn to her progress, measuring the strength in her movements, the tilt of her shoulders, the way she stood against the wind. She reminded him, in some faraway way, of his late wife Caroline, who'd once faced the wild with that same mix of grace and stubborn will before sickness had taken her and left him hollow. He tried to tell himself that watching Clara was just habit, that he was keeping an eye on her the same way he'd watch the weather. But the truth gnawed at him every night, when he saw the faint glow of her lantern flickering through the trees. The woman didn't belong to this land, not yet, but she was fighting to, and part of him couldn't help but root for her. One evening, as the wind picked up and the first flakes of snow began to fall, he caught sight of her again swinging the axe with trembling arms, her breath ragged, her coat soaked through. He felt his hand twitch toward his reins, the instinct to ride down and help her nearly winning out. But he stopped himself. She wouldn't want it, not yet. Pride ran deep in folks who chose solitude. He knew that all too well. Instead, he watched her drive one last log into place before collapsing onto the steps of her half-finished cabin, her shoulders shaking with exhaustion. For a long time, he didn't move. He could see her clearly even through the curtain of falling snow, her face turned toward the sky, eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer or curse. The sight stirred something old and dangerous in him, a memory of purpose, of care, of the man he'd been before grief turned his heart to stone. He muttered under his breath, "Don't do it, Boone." But the words sounded weak even to his own ears. The frontier had its rules, and he'd learned every one of them the hard way. Never trust easily, never linger too long, and never, ever get attached. Yet as he turned his horse toward home, the sound of her axe still echoing faintly behind him, Elias Boone knew that sooner or later, those rules would break, because out here, even silence had a way of leading a man straight into trouble he didn't know he needed. The storm rolled in faster than any of them expected, crawling over the mountains like a living thing, swallowing the sky until day turned to dusk and the air stung sharp with sleet. Elias Boone had seen winters break strong men before saw them freeze with rifles in hand, their pride colder than the wind that killed them, and when he looked at the black clouds piling over the ridge, he thought of the woman again. He told himself it wasn't his concern. She'd chosen this, chosen the solitude and the fight that came with it. Still, he saddled his horse before dawn, muttering curses into the icy wind, and set out toward her clearing. The trail was near invisible, the snow already thick and deep, and each gust sliced through his coat like a blade. When he finally reached the edge of the trees, he almost turned back, convinced she'd taken shelter or given up and gone to town. But then he saw her. Clara stood on the half-finished roof of her cabin, her dress plastered to her legs, her hair frozen in clumps around her face. She was trying to hammer a split log into place where the wind had torn the boards loose, her fingers stiff and bloodless around the handle. Her lips were blue, her movements desperate, and every so often she'd stop to catch her breath, coughing into her sleeve before forcing herself back to work. Boone felt a curse rise in his throat. "Damn fool," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he meant her or himself, because before he could think twice he was off his horse and striding through the snow toward her. She didn't see him until his hand caught the ladder to steady it. Her head snapped down, eyes wide, fear flickering there before recognition replaced it. She opened her mouth to speak, but he only said, "Roof's not worth dying over." His voice came out rough, colder than he meant it, but it stopped her all the same. She hesitated, breath coming out in shivers, then nodded once and handed him the hammer without a word. He climbed up beside her, boots slipping on the slick boards, and together they worked in silence, the only sound the wind and the hollow thud of nails biting into wood. He could see the exhaustion in her every movement, the way her body swayed with fatigue, but she didn't complain, didn't even look at him except to pass another nail. There was something about her determination that both angered and humbled him, a kind of quiet defiance against the cold and the odds that no man could reason with. When the last board was secured and the worst of the leak patched, she sank down on the edge of the roof, her hands trembling. "You shouldn't have come," she managed between breaths. Boone didn't answer. He climbed down first, checking his horse's reins, then looked up at her through the swirling snow. "Next time," he said evenly, "let the storm win around. You don't have to fight it alone." Her eyes softened a little, surprise flickering through them, and for the first time, he saw the faintest ghost of a smile. She opened her mouth to thank him, but before a word could form, he was already mounting his horse. The wind caught his hat brim as he turned away, his silhouette swallowed by the flurry of white. He didn't look back not once, but as he rode down through the ravine, the image of her sitting on that roof stayed with him, stubborn and unyielding against the storm. By the time he reached his own land, snow had buried his tracks, erasing any sign he'd been there at all. Yet in the quiet of his barn, as he stripped the ice from his gloves, Boone muttered to himself, "Reckon she'll make it," though his tone held the uneasy truth that if she didn't, he'd be the one who couldn't rest easy again. Winter settled deep into the valley, the kind that pressed down on the world like a held breath, and for weeks the snow never fully melted, only hardened into glittering crust that snapped underfoot. The sky stayed gray, the sun a pale ghost behind clouds, and still Elias Boone found himself riding the ridge each morning, telling himself he was checking the line fences or tracking elk, though he knew damned well what pulled him that way. Each time he passed her clearing, he caught sight of her Clara moving slow but steady, splitting kindling or hanging blankets to dry beside the cabin's small smoking chimney. She never looked up when he was there, never waved, but somehow he always found a reason to linger a little longer than sense allowed. The first time he left wood by her porch, he did it half in anger with her stubbornness, with his own restless conscience. He stacked it neatly, 4 rows high, and rode off before she could spot him. The next morning, he found a bundle of bread on a flat stone by the trail, wrapped in cloth still warm from baking. He stared at it for a long time, chewing the inside of his cheek before tucking it into his saddlebag. A week later, when he saw her fence sagging under the weight of snow, he fixed it quietly while she was off fetching water, his breath clouding the cold air. When he returned home that night, there was a pouch of coffee beans waiting on his doorstep, real beans, the kind no one wasted on a man who kept to himself. And so began the strange rhythm between them, a bond built not with words but with the quiet exchange of care. He'd find excuses to stop by sometimes with firewood, sometimes with a few strips of dried venison, and she'd answer in kind, her tokens small but thoughtful. Once, he found a handkerchief stitched with his initials tied to his saddle horn, the thread uneven but careful, and it made something in his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. He never mentioned it, never thanked her, but he kept it in his pocket all the same. When they did see each other, their words were brief and practical. "Roof holding up?" he'd ask. "Better than last time," she'd answer. "You got enough wood to last the week?" he'd press. "More than I did yesterday," she'd say. And that would be that. Yet beneath the simplicity of it, something grew, a quiet understanding, unspoken but steady, that neither of them was as alone as they used to be. There were days when he'd catch her humming softly while she worked, and though she stopped the moment she saw him, the sound lingered in his mind long after he'd ridden off. He told himself it was nothing, just decency, neighborly habit. But when he found himself cutting more wood than his hearth needed, or glancing toward the ridge before dusk, he stopped pretending. The truth was, he looked forward to the signs of her as much as the sunrise, the faint curl of smoke from her chimney, the footprints around her well, the delicate thread of connection tying his solitude to hers. On the coldest nights, when the wind screamed down from the mountains and rattled the shutters of his empty house, he'd sit by the fire and think about the stubborn woman on the hill, and the strange comfort her presence brought to a man who had once sworn never to need anyone again. He didn't call it friendship, didn't dare call it anything at all, but in that bond of silence, those small, wordless acts that crossed the snow between them, something tender had begun to root itself, fragile but alive, in the frozen heart of winter. By the time spring's thaw began to loosen the valley from winter's grip, word of Elias Boone's quiet visits had already drifted into town like smoke curling from a far-off fire. The settlement was small, just a cluster of clapboard buildings, a saloon, a church, and a handful of people too used to each other's lives to mind their own, and gossip there spread quicker than prairie wind. Boone's found himself a widow. Old Sam Dyer said over cards one night, his grin half hidden beneath his mustache. Out there on the ridge, heard she's younger too. Pretty thing, they say, for someone mad enough to live alone. The laughter that followed was sharp, brittle, the kind that carried equal parts envy and judgment. Others chimed in, women shaking their heads over sewing circles, men muttering between sips of whiskey. Ain't right, one said. His wife's been gone, what, 3 years? Maybe 4? Closer to 5, another corrected. And you can't blame a man for needin' company. Besides, she's not bad to look at. Then came the quieter whispers, the kind meant to wound. That Clara Monroe was running from something back east. That she wasn't a widow at all but a woman with secrets trailing behind her like smoke. That Boone, lonely fool that he was, had let himself be taken in. The rumors twisted and tangled with each retelling until no one knew what was truth anymore, only that it was worth talking about. Elias heard it. Of course he couldn't help it. Even a man who avoided company as much as he did couldn't stop the wind from carrying words. The blacksmith told him first, half apologetic, while shoeing his horse. You might want to keep clear of town for a spell, he said. Folks got too much time and not enough decency. Boone only nodded, his jaw tight. But later that night, as he rode back through the cottonwoods toward home, the gossip followed him like a ghost. He told himself he didn't care. He'd been talked about before after his wife's death, after he shut his doors and let the world forget his name. But the lies about Clara stirred something deeper than anger. They stirred guilt, the kind that had never quite healed. The moon was high when he stopped by the ridge, meaning only to drop off a bundle of seed grain. But when he saw the light in her window, he lingered, his hand resting against the saddle horn. In the glow from inside, he caught a glimpse of her silhouette bent over the table, sewing by lamplight, her hair loose around her shoulders. The sight hit him harder than he expected. Caroline had done that once, years ago, humming while she mended his shirts by the fire. He could almost smell the soap on her skin, hear her soft laugh when he'd tease her for stitching too slow. The ache that rose in his chest was sudden and sharp, the kind that made a man's throat feel too small. He'd buried Caroline under a mesquite tree on the south edge of his land, and though he'd marked her grave, he'd never gone back, couldn't stand to. Now, watching Clara, guilt twisted through him like barbed wire. He felt like he was betraying the memory of the woman who'd once been his whole world. He dismounted without thinking, running his glove over the frostbitten fence post, trying to steady the thoughts clawing through his mind. He wasn't chasing anyone. He wasn't looking to replace what was gone. He just couldn't let another soul freeze to death in silence. That was what he told himself, again and again, until the lie sounded almost true. But as he turned to leave, the sound of Clara's laughter drifted faintly through the glass, soft, warm, alive, and something in him cracked just enough for the truth to slip through, that he wasn't saving her anymore. She was saving him, piece by piece, without even knowing it. And that more than the town's gossip, terrified him most of all. The wind had turned strange that evening, still and heavy, the kind that carried a tension too quiet to ignore. Clara felt it first, a prickle at the back of her neck as she set a pot of stew on the hearth, the fire throwing long, restless shadows against the walls. Outside, the last light of dusk bled into the hills, and the forest went unnervingly still. She tried to shake the feeling off, but years of living on the edge of danger had taught her when to listen to her instincts. Her shotgun leaned by the door, always within reach. She'd just finished fastening the shutters when the horses came, 2 of them, fast and mean, the sound of hooves tearing through the frozen dirt. The dogs started barking, their growls swallowed by the thunder of approaching riders. Before she could react, a rough voice shouted from outside. "Evenin', miss. Don't mean no harm, just lookin' to share your fire." But there was laughter behind the words, cruel and taunting, the kind that turned her stomach to ice. "Ain't nothin' here for you," she called back, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "You best move on." "Now that don't sound neighborly," came the reply, closer this time, followed by the sharp crack of a boot against her door. The wood splintered but held. Clara grabbed the shotgun, her heart hammering as the latch gave way on the next kick. The door burst open, and 2 men spilled into the room, dust-caked drifters with eyes too wild and smiles too thin. One grabbed for her arm, the other swept his gaze over the small cabin, landing on the shelves of canned food and the stack of blankets by the fire. "Looks like we found ourselves a clever little settler," the taller one sneered. "And all alone, too." Clara didn't think she fired. The blast tore through the air, deafening in the small space. The first man went down hard, clutching his leg and howling. The other lunged, knocking the gun from her hands. She fought back with everything she had, clawing, kicking, her strength born of desperation. He struck her once, the world flashing white, but she didn't fall. Not until he threw her hard against the table, her breath crushed from her chest. He raised his pistol, the metallic click echoing in her ears, and then came another sound, sharper and truer. The crack of a rifle split the night. The bandit's body jerked as the bullet hit his arm, sending his weapon spinning into the fire. He screamed, stumbling backward as another shot rang out, this one taking the hat clean off his head. "You picked the wrong valley," came a low, familiar voice from the darkness outside. Elias Boone stepped through the shattered doorway, rifle steady despite the blood already soaking his shoulder. His horse stood somewhere behind him, breath steaming in the cold. "Get up," he ordered the wounded man on the floor, "and take your friend with you before I finish what I started." They didn't hesitate. Dragging each other, they fled into the night, their curses fading into the distance. Elias lowered the rifle, his breathing ragged. Clara stumbled toward him, the firelight catching on the crimson stain spreading down his sleeve. "You're hit," she said, her voice shaking as she reached for him. "It's nothin'," he muttered, though his knees told a different story. She guided him to the chair by the fire, her hands trembling as she tore a strip from her apron to press against the wound. The smell of blood mixed with smoke and gunpowder, sharp and metallic. "You could have been killed," she whispered. "So could you," he rasped, wincing as the cloth met his skin. For a long moment, they said nothing, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. When she finally looked up, his eyes were on her not with pity or heroism, but something deeper, steadier. "You keep a good aim," he said quietly. "And you keep bad timing," she replied, her voice breaking, into a laugh half-choked by tears. Outside, the night closed in again. The danger gone, but the air still heavy with its echo. The rifle sat cooling by the hearth, the cabin walls scarred and smoking. But in the midst of ruin, something else had been built, an unspoken truth stronger than fear, forged in gunfire and the fragile mercy of being found. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that danced across the cabin walls, flickering over the blood-dark stain spreading across Elias Boone's shoulder. He tried to tell her again that it wasn't bad, that he'd had worse. But the words came out weaker each time, swallowed by the hiss of the wind outside. Clara pressed the cloth harder against the wound, her hands steady despite the tremor in her breath. "Hold still," she said softly, her voice the calm of someone who'd already lived through worse storms. The bandits' tracks were long gone now, buried beneath a veil of falling snow, and only the two of them remained in the fragile warmth of her little home. She'd already cut away his coat, her fingers slick with blood as she cleaned the wound with boiled water and whiskey. Each time he winced, she muttered something under her breath, half scolding, half prayer, and though he couldn't make out the words, they steadied him more than the drink ever could. He'd never been tended to like this since Caroline died. Never felt the small, human touch of care that didn't ask for anything in return. The firelight glowed on Clara's face, her hair falling loose as she worked, jaw set in concentration. When she finally tied the bandage in place and leaned back, her hands fell still in her lap, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked tired. Not from the night, but from a weight that had been carried too long alone. "You didn't have to do that," he rasped, meaning the tending, the staying up, all of it. She gave a faint smile. "You didn't have to come," she said. Her tone wasn't teasing, it was an acknowledgement, quiet and heavy with gratitude. He wanted to tell her it was nothing, that he'd done what any man with a rifle and a conscience would have, but the lie stuck in his throat. Instead, he asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the night he first saw her hammering in the rain. "Why out? Here?" he said finally. "Why alone?" For a long time she didn't answer. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Then she said, "My husband was a miner. Good man, proud man. When the work dried up, he wanted to go east, start over. I told him I wouldn't follow. This was our home. This land. This sky. He said I was too stubborn, like always." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the snow pressed soft against the glass. A month later, the mine collapsed. Buried 40 men, including him. I went into town to ask for help, and they just stared. They said it was my fault if I'd gone with him. He wouldn't have been there that day. One woman even said maybe the earth was teaching me a lesson. Her voice caught on the last word, a brittle sound that broke through his ribs like splintered glass. "So I sold what little was left, came up here, and built this." She gestured weakly at the rough walls around them. "I wanted to prove I didn't need their pity, that I could live without being someone's burden." Elias didn't speak for a long time. He could hear the pain in her words, the quiet defiance beneath it, the same fire he'd seen in her eyes when she stood alone in the rain. "Finally," he said, "you don't owe those people a damn thing." His voice was rough, the kind that scraped on the way out. She looked at him, and something like relief flickered in her expression, small, uncertain, but real. "Maybe," she said softly, "but sometimes I think I owe something to myself." He nodded, understanding more than he could say. The night stretched on, the storm easing to a whisper. She stayed by his side, stoking the fire, her hand brushing his when she checked the bandage. Outside, the snow fell steady and soft, covering the scars of the fight, the blood in the dirt, the footprints leading to the door. By the time dawn crept pale through the window, he'd fallen asleep in the chair, and Clara sat beside him, her head resting against the wall, watching the light spill slowly across the room she'd built with her own 2 hands, the room where, for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. The days that followed unfolded slowly, tenderly, like spring testing its strength against the last edge of winter. The snow began to melt off the roofs and tree limbs, turning the valley into a maze of glittering streams. And with each dawn that came, Elias Boone found himself at Clara's cabin a little longer than the last. His shoulders still ached when he lifted anything heavy, the wound not yet fully mended, but he worked anyway, stubborn as ever, driving nails into the porch beam while she handed him boards smoothed by her careful hands. The rhythm of their labor fell into something easy, something wordless but whole, a shared understanding that neither of them had to fill the silence with anything more than the scrape of tools and the soft hum of wind through pine. Every so often she'd glance up, brush a loose strand of hair from her face, and catch him watching her. He'd turn away too quickly, muttering something about the measure being off, but she'd smile anyway, a faint curve of the lips that lingered even when he wasn't looking. When they rested, they'd sit side by side on the half-built porch, passing a tin of coffee between them, their shoulders barely touching but close enough that the warmth of it felt like something sacred. He told her things he hadn't said aloud in years, how the house on his ranch had gone quiet after his wife, Caroline, passed. How he'd spent months walking from room to room like a ghost, keeping busy only so he wouldn't remember what it meant to feel. Clara listened without pity, her gaze steady, her hands wrapped around the tin as if holding the weight of his words. "I buried my laughter with her," he said once, his voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't think I'd ever dig it back up." She tilted her head, a hint of softness in her eyes. "Then maybe it's time to start digging." The first time she made him laugh. It wasn't much, just a small sound, half surprise and half release. He'd been trying to lift a beam into place with one arm, cursing under his breath, when she'd said, "You're too proud to ask for help, aren't you?" And he'd looked at her with mock offense until her deadpan expression cracked into a grin. The laugh slipped out before he could stop it, rough and rusty like an old gate swinging open, but it was real. It startled them both, hanging there in the spring air like something fragile and new. From that moment, something changed. They talked more about the land, about the storms that nearly broke them, about the ghosts they'd both learned to live beside. She told him how she'd wake some nights, convinced she heard her husband's voice in the wind, and he admitted he still sometimes set a second plate at the table before remembering there was no one left to fill it. But as they shared these confessions, something else wove quietly between them, not just sorrow, but solace. Their grief didn't erase itself, it simply found company, and that made it bearable. On evenings when the light stretched long across the ridge, they'd sit on the finished porch, watching the sky burn pink and gold. He'd say something dry about the stubborn mule she'd bought or the crooked fence post by the barn, and she'd laugh, not the guarded kind she used to hide behind, but a warm, unburdened sound that filled the space like music. Sometimes, when he laughed with her, she'd feel it in her chest, a pulse of something dangerous, hopeful, alive. And when the stars began to shimmer and the chill crept back, he'd pull his coat tighter, glance her way, and murmur, "Looks like you're finally building more than a cabin, Clara." She'd smile faintly and reply, "Looks like you're remembering how to live, Elias." And between them, in the soft quiet of the mountain dusk, the two widowed hearts that had once sworn themselves to silence began, at last, to speak. Spring swept through the valley like a blessing hard-won, softening the ground, coaxing green from the hills, and washing the sky clean of its winter gray. And with it came a kind of restlessness neither Elias Boone nor Clara Monroe could name. The snow had melted from the roofs, the rivers swelled, and life crept back into every hollow and fence post. It was on one of those bright mornings, when the air smelled of lilac and thawed pine, that Elias's grown daughter, Annie Boone, rode up the ridge trail on a chestnut mare, sunlight flashing off her auburn hair and the easy smile that reminded him of the wife he'd buried years ago. She swung down from the saddle like she owned the earth beneath her boots, grinning at her father before turning her gaze to Clara, who stood by the porch with her hands dusted in flour. "So you're the woman who finally got him talking again," she said with a teasing warmth that made Clara blush. Annie announced she was staying through the weekend for the spring barn dance in town, and before Elias could protest, she'd already decided they were both coming. Clara tried to laugh it off, saying she hadn't danced in years, that she didn't belong in a place like that. But Annie only smiled and said, "You belong wherever you've built something with your own hands." When the night arrived, the valley shimmered under starlight, the town hall glowing with lanterns and fiddle music spilling into the dirt street. Clara hesitated at the door, her pale blue dress trembling against her legs, the stitches uneven but made with care. She'd spent the afternoon convincing herself she was ready, but the moment she stepped inside, the noise dimmed and the whispers started. "That's Boone's woman," someone muttered near the cider barrels. "Built herself a shack up in the hills, thinks she's a rancher now. Heard she trapped him," another voice said, laughing low. "Ain't no man that lonely unless he's gone soft." The words struck like stones, and for a moment she wished she'd never come. She could feel the weight of every stare, every smirk, the memory of their mockery the day she first came to town, when they'd called her foolish for trying to live alone. She turned toward the door, ready to flee, when a voice cut through the noise, sharp, familiar, and calm as thunder before the strike. "That's enough." Elias Boone stood near the bandstand, tall and unflinching, his hat in his hand and his gaze fixed on the room. The crowd went still as he crossed the floor, boots heavy against the boards, and took Clara's shaking hand in his. "This woman," he said, his voice low but carrying, "has more grit than any 10 of you put together. She built a home where there was nothing but wilderness, faced storms, hunger, and worse, and didn't break. "She's the bravest woman I know, and I'll thank you to remember it." No one spoke. Even the fiddler froze, bow trembling midair. Clara's breath caught, her heart slamming against her ribs as he turned to her and, with the faintest smile, led her to the center of the floor. The music started again, hesitant at first, then stronger, the rhythm steadying as they began to move. She hadn't danced in years and stepped awkwardly, but his hand at her waist was sure, his eyes soft with something she couldn't name. Around them, the whispers died, replaced by silence, and then, slowly, applause quiet, uncertain, then full. When the song ended, Elias tipped his hat, still holding her hand, and murmured just for her, "Let 'em talk. You've earned every step." And for the first time since she'd come to this valley, Clara Monroe didn't feel like the widow on the ridge. She felt like a woman who belonged. The ride home was quiet in the way only spring nights could be. The air cool but gentle, carrying the sweet scent of rain-soaked earth and wild sage through the valley as the moon laid silver light across the trail. Clara rode beside Elias, her cheeks still flushed from the dance, her hands steady on the reins though her heart was anything but. Neither of them spoke much. Words seemed too clumsy for what hung between them, but every time their horses' shoulders brushed, the silence deepened into something warm and unspoken. The night hummed with the sound of crickets and the faint rush of water from the creek below, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called a long, lonesome cry that didn't sound so lonely anymore. When they reached her clearing, the cabin came into view, small and solid against the starlit ridge, smoke curling from the chimney like a sigh of contentment. Elias reined in, intending only to see her safely home, but something in the sight of that place made him pause. It looked different now, softer, alive. In the months since he'd first found her here, half frozen and fierce, the land had changed along with her. Where once the ground around the porch had been bare and hard, there were now flowers, wild lupine and yellow prairie stars, their petals swaying in the night breeze, roots deep in the soil she'd tended with her own hands. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the damp earth, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at the small miracle she'd made out of this wilderness. "Didn't notice these before," he said, his voice rough, almost reverent. Clara followed his gaze, smiling faintly as she knelt to touch the blossoms. "Planted them when the thaw came," she said softly. "Didn't think they'd take, but they did. Guess they were waiting for the right season." Her words lingered in the air, simple but heavy with meaning, and Elias felt something stir in his chest, a quiet understanding that what she said wasn't just about flowers. He looked at the cabin, the solid porch they'd built together, the windows patched with new panes that caught the moonlight, and realized that it wasn't just her life that had been rebuilt here. He'd been rebuilding too, plank by plank, moment by moment, without even knowing it. The grief that had once hollowed him out had found somewhere to rest, not buried, not forgotten, but softened, shaped into something that made room for light again. He thought of the laughter that had returned to his voice, of the mornings he woke now with purpose instead of ache, and he saw it all reflected in her eyes, the same healing, the same stubborn faith in life after loss. "You did all this yourself?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She brushed dirt from her hands and stood, the firelight from inside catching in her hair. "Not all by myself," she said, meeting his gaze. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The distance between them felt small, like the space between one breath and the next, and the silence carried everything words could not. He wanted to tell her how proud he was, how much she'd changed the shape of his days without trying, but the words tangled somewhere between his chest and throat. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and soap clinging to her skin. "They're beautiful," he murmured finally, his voice barely more than the wind. "They're yours too," she replied. And though the words were soft, they struck something deep. He looked down then, at the flowers growing wild against the cabin's rough-hewn steps, and thought of how life had a way of returning when you least expected it, how sometimes it didn't take much more than two hands willing to build and one heart daring to hope. And as the night settled quiet around them, Elias Boone realized that for the first time since burying his wife, he didn't feel like a man haunted by what he'd lost, but like one blessed by what he'd found. By the time summer rolled over the ridge, The cabin no longer looked like a fragile dream carved out of defiance. It stood proud and whole beneath the wide blue sky, its walls cured by sun and rain, its windows gleaming with the reflection of two lives quietly mended. The wildflowers Clara had planted months ago had spread across the yard in a riot of color, winding between fence posts and along the stone path like a living border of hope. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney even in the warmth of evening, and the porch Elias Boone had helped her build creaked with the soft comfort of use instead of solitude. Inside, the scent of coffee and fresh bread mixed with pine resin and the faint sweetness of lavender drying near the hearth. He had been coming by every day since the thaw, sometimes to fix a hinge or mend a fence, sometimes with a basket of eggs or a book he thought she might like. But lately there was no reason at all, just the quiet pull of belonging that led him up the ridge without thought or plan. One morning, without ceremony, he brought a trunk from his ranch spare clothes, an old rifle, his late wife's Bible, a few tools worn smooth from years of work, and set them beside her doorway. Clara didn't say a word, just smiled and went back to stirring the stew, as if she'd known this moment would come all along. From that day forward, the cabin was no longer hers alone, and yet it didn't feel divided, it felt doubled, as though every echo of loneliness in the walls had finally found its answer. The nights grew softer after that. They shared the simple rhythm of days spent working the land, fixing what needed mending, and talking in low voices by the fire when the stars came out. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. Sometimes the silence between them said everything worth knowing. Elias would sit in his chair, shoulder brushing hers, his rough hand resting near enough for her to find it when the past grew too heavy. On one such night, with the crickets humming outside and the air warm against the window glass, Clara leaned into him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. The fire cast slow, golden light across the room, touching the faces of two people who had once thought their hearts were beyond repair. "You watched me build this place, Elias," she said softly, her voice half laughter, half longing. "Now help me fill it." He turned to her, the words catching somewhere deep inside him, and for the first time in years, he didn't think of loss or guilt or what the town might say. He thought of the sound of her laughter in the morning, of the strength in her hands, of the way his heart steadied when she was near. Slowly, he reached for her hands, scarred, strong, and steady like his own, and their fingers laced together, rough palms fitting as if shaped by the same storms. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, carrying the scent of rain and wildflowers across the clearing, and the cabin that had once been a symbol of solitude now glowed like a promise kept. Two broken souls, once strangers bound by grief, had found not just shelter but a kind of home the world rarely offered to those who'd already lost everything. And as the fire dimmed to embers, Elias Boone looked into the flames and saw not the ghosts of what he'd buried, but the quiet miracle of what still lived, a future built, not out of need or pity, but out of the slow, steadfast courage of love returned.